I want to ask you a question, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer it immediately. Imagine you lost everything. Not in a moment, in a slow, sustained, deliberate removal. Your home, your workplace, your child's school, the hospital you would go to when you're sick, the road you drove on, the water that came out of your tap, the power that lit your room at night, one by one, day by day, over months, over years. Then imagine that your neighbour lost everything, and their neighbour, and the people on the next street, and the next. That everywhere you looked, the people you knew were in the same position. No one had anything to offer anybody else. Nobody had the resources to help. The community that might have held you up was itself drowning. And then imagine that this has been going on for 900 days, that there was no end in sight, that the forces doing it showed no sign of stopping, and that the world, the watching world, had largely moved on to the next story. I want you to hold that image because it is not hypothetical. It is a description of what is happening right now to the people of Gaza. And I think most of us, if we are honest, have stopped holding that image at the forefront of our minds. We have been encouraged to stop holding it, and this video is about why that matters and what it says about us. Next, I'm going to talk about the scale of what has been taken. Let's be precise about what has happened, not the politics, not the competing claims about who started what and why, the concrete, documented facts of what has been removed from the lives of the people of Gaza, the dead. Max Planck Institute estimates more than 112,000 deaths as of November 2025. 25% of them were children under 15. Those are not statistics. Each one was a person with a name, family, a history, a future that no longer exists. Life expectancy in Gaza was 75 and comparable to many middle-income countries, and a figure that had been steadily rising for decades. But research published in the Lancet estimates that life expectancy in Gaza has now fallen to approximately 40 years. For males, it has fallen to 35.6 years. That is not a health statistic in any conventional sense. It is a measure of what systematic destruction does to a population over time. The direct deaths, the collapsed healthcare system, the malnutrition, the disease that follows the removal of clean water and sanitation. No comparable decline has been recorded in modern history. Next to children in education, approximately 660,000 children in Gaza have had no school for 3 consecutive academic years. 3 years. The children who were 5 when this began are now 8. The foundational years of their cognitive development, the years when language, numeracy, and the capacity for abstract thought are being laid down, have been spent in rubble, in displacement, in fear. That is not a gap in education that can be filled later. Developmental windows close. The research of this is not contested. Approximately 20,000 students have been killed and about 1,000 educational staff. 97 to 98% of Gaza school buildings have been damaged or destroyed, including 19 universities. And it is not just what they have not learned, it is what they have experienced instead. 3 years of witnessing death, displacement, hunger, and destruction is a traumatic load that will shape the psychology of an entire generation. There is no school that teaches you to process that. There is no curriculum that repairs it. Next, I'll talk about professions and institutions. Gaza before October 2023 had doctors, engineers, teachers, accountants, managers, business people. People who had spent years building expertise, people who ran things. The death toll has not fallen evenly. Universities, hospitals, and professional buildings have been struck. The people inside them, the educated, the skilled, the institutionally capable, have died or been displaced at significant rates. What remains is not just a destroyed physical infrastructure, it is a destroyed human infrastructure. The institutional knowledge, the accumulated expertise of functioning society has been removed. Even if the buildings were rebuilt tomorrow, the people who knew how to run them are gone. There is no functioning economy in Gaza. The UNCTAD reports that the real GDP in Gaza shrank by 83% in 2024 alone, 87% across 2023 and 2024 combined. GDP per capita has fallen to approximately $161 per year, 44 cents per day, returning to levels last seen in 2003. 100% of Gaza's population now lives in multidimensional poverty. Unemployment stands at 80%. Consumer prices surged 238% in 2024 alone. The World Bank estimates reconstruction will require more than 70 billion and could take until 2023 or beyond. The professionals who had careers to return to do not have those careers anymore. You do not return to a career after 900 days of surviving. You try to reconstruct one from nothing in a destroyed landscape with no functioning institutional framework around you. And the infrastructure, water, power, roads, hospitals, the physical systems that make civilized life possible have been systematically destroyed. 94% of all hospitals in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Only 19 of the 36 hospitals remain even partially functional. No hospital is fully operational. The WHO has recorded nearly 700 attacks on healthcare facilities since October 2023. At least 1,701 medical personnel have been killed. More than 235 journalists have been killed. More than any other modern conflict. More than the US Civil War, both world wars, Vietnam and Afghanistan combined. Access to accurate information about what is happening has been deliberately and systematically eliminated. There is a comparison worth making carefully. Medieval warfare, at its most punishing, used the siege. You surrounded a city, you cut off its food, its water, its ability to trade, its ability to resupply, and you wait. The city does not fall in battle, it falls in a slow, grinding collapse of the conditions that made life sustainable. The people do not die in combat for the most part. They die of hunger, disease, and the psychological consequences of prolonged containment with no prospect of relief. The comparison is not perfect, but the structure is similar. What is happening in Gaza is not primarily a military campaign against combatants. It is the sustained destruction of the conditions that make civilized life possible applied to an entire civilian population. The distinction the law of armed conflict draws between combatants and civilians, between military targets and civilian infrastructure, has been progressively eroded to the point where it's lost its practical meaning. But there is a dimension to this that medieval siege warfare did not have, and that makes it in some ways more cruel rather than less. The medieval city under siege at least had the prospect of surrender and relief. The siege would end. Life, however reduced, would resume. But what is happening in Gaza has no clear end condition. There is no surrender that would be accepted. There is no negotiation that has produced a durable outcome. There is no visible horizon at which killing stops and reconstruction begins. 900 days, 900 mornings waking up to the same reality. No school, no work, no functioning economy, displacement, hunger, the constant presence of death. And every day that passes is not neutral. It's actively destructive. The developmental loss in children compounds. The psychological damage deepens. The professional skills atrophy. The hope, the things that make future-orientated action possible, drains away. We tend to think of punishment as something that happens and then ends. Prison has a sentence. A fine has an amount. Medieval punishment, public, brutal, physical, was at least over. What is being inflicted here is a punishment without a defined end. It is ongoing. It is cumulative. It is targeting something more than the body. It is targeting the conditions that make a human life feel worth living. Pride, ambition, the sense that tomorrow might actually be better than today. Enterprise, the ability to provide for your family, the ability to educate your children, the ability to imagine a future. Those things once lost for long enough are extraordinarily difficult to restore, and every day they are not restored, they become harder to restore. That is not accidental. That is what sustained, comprehensive destruction does. And next I'll talk about self-reflection and what we would do. Because I want to return to the question I asked at the beginning, not rhetorically, genuinely. If a foreign power had been bombing your city for 900 days, if your children had not been to school for 3 years, if the hospital where you would take your sick child no longer existed, if the business you had built over 20 years had been destroyed, if your neighbours were in the same position and there was nobody nearby with resources to help you, what would you do? What would you do after 6 months, after a year, after 2 years, after you'd watched people you'd loved die? After the place you called home no longer existed? After every system you relied on had been removed? I'm not asking you this to justify any particular action. I am asking it because I think most of us, if we were honest, do not really apply our own humanity to this situation. We process it as a news story, as something that happens to other people in another place, governed by rules and context we do not understand. We do not sit with it in the way we would sit with it if it were our street, our children, and our city. And I think that distance, that failure to genuinely imagine ourselves in that position, is part of why the world has been able to watch for 900 days without the sustained moral response that 900 days of this should produce. There is also a deeper question. When people in impossible situations respond in ways that look to outside observers like desperation or violence or irrationality, when people who have lost everything do things that people who have lost nothing find difficult to understand, the standard response is to judge their response rather than to examine the conditions that produced it. Whatever their response is, they will be blamed for it, hit with overwhelming force, and it will not make the front pages. That asymmetry of power, of coverage, of accountability is not neutral. It is a feature of the situation, and recognizing it is not the same as endorsing any particular act. It's simply being honest about what an impossible situation looks like from inside it. Next, I'm going to talk about where is the humanity, the moral failure of institutions. The question of where the humanity is belongs to everybody, to governments that could apply pressure and have not, to media organisations that have moved on to the next story, to all of us who have continued with our days as normal while 900 days of this have passed. But it belongs particularly to religious institutions because the moral framework that should produce the loudest, most sustained, most unambiguous response to what is happening in Gaza is the one that religious institutions claim as their own. Love your neighbour, the sanctity of human life, the obligation to protect the vulnerable, care for the orphan, the widow, the stranger. These are not obscure theological points. They are the stated foundation of the traditions that have hundreds of millions of followers. The exception, Pope Leo XIV in his Palm Sunday homily on the 29th of March 2026 said what religious leaders should be saying. He called for a ceasefire. He said God does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war. He said lay down your weapons. You can disagree with his theology, and this channel has examined the counter-arguments, but you cannot say he was silent. He was not silent. He used the platform that comes with the position to say the thing that needed saying. That is what moral leadership looks like. He is largely an exception. Next, I'll talk about the prosperity gospel and the corrupted institution. There is a question worth asking about how we got to a place where significant numbers of people who describe themselves as Christians are not only silent about Gaza, but in some ways actively celebrating the destruction. And I think the answer lies in what has happened to the institution through which they receive their faith. When the church's primary business model is donations, when sermons spend significant portions of their time on appeals for money, when the visible lifestyle of the leadership is private jets, designer clothing, when the measure of success is audience size and income rather than spiritual depth and moral formation, something has changed. The institution is no longer a primary vehicle for transmitting the values of the faith. It is primarily a business, and business is optimized for revenue. The congregation becomes a customer base rather than a community of moral formation. The congregation gives money on faith, that has been trained to trust the institution without scrutiny, to accept what they are told without checking, to experience doubt as spiritual failure rather than intellectual honesty. A congregation that can be told almost anything, and what they have been told in many cases is that the destruction of Gaza is God's will, that it is biblical prophecy being fulfilled, that supporting it is an act of faith rather than a moral failure. That is not a description of faith in God, it is a description of faith in the institution, and the institution in this case is demonstrably corruptible. When the goal is primarily money, and the corrupted speak in the name of the pious, and the people who have been taught not to check cannot tell the difference. Next, I'll talk about the Armageddon theology. There is a specific theological strand worth naming. There are significant numbers of people within American evangelical Christianity who believe that the escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, the destruction, the war, the chaos, is not a tragedy to be prevented, but a prophecy to be fulfilled. That the worse things get, the closer to the return of Christ. That working towards peace is counterproductive. That what looks like hell on earth is actually progress towards heaven. This is dissonance worth naming directly. People who identify as followers of the Prince of Peace, who carry the book that says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," are celebrating the conditions of war, famine, disease, and the destruction of human lives because they believe it brings them closer to God, who said, "Love your neighbor." They have not noticed the contradiction, or have they been trained not to notice? Here is the question dissonance produces. If you are celebrating hell on earth, if you are watching destruction, famine, the death of children, the removal of hope from an entire people, who exactly do you think you are worshipping? Because the God you described in the text you claim to follow said, "I was hungry and you gave me food. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was sick and you took care of me. What you do to the least of these, you do to me." The theology that celebrates the suffering of the least of these has departed from the text it invokes, significantly, permanently, and the people it has departed furthest from are the people of Gaza. Next, I'm going to talk about the forgetting, why we stop seeing. One of the things that happens over 900 days is the world stops paying attention. Not all at once, gradually. The front page becomes page 3 becomes a paragraph, the paragraph disappears, and the people experience it do not disappear. They are still there, every day, the same reality, slightly worse. We are, as a species, not well equipped for sustained attention to distant suffering. Our empathy is calibrated for proximity, for the person in front of us, for the community around us. The psychological literature on compassion fatigue is extensive. It is real. It is not a moral failing in the individual to struggle to sustain attention to suffering that is geographically distant and temporarily extended. But there is something happening that is more than compassion fatigue. There is the active encouragement to look elsewhere. The news cycle moves, new crisis emerges, the algorithm serves the next thing, and there is in some quarters an explicit interest in the story not being told. Coverage of Gaza has declined, journalists have been killed, more than any comparable conflict in recent history. Access has been restricted. The mechanisms by which a story stays in public consciousness have been deliberately undermined. This matters because forgetting is part of the punishment. If the world watches, the pressure to stop is real. If the world looks away, there is no pressure. The forgetting is not a passive consequence of news cycles. It is, in part, a strategic outcome. And we participate in it every time we move on without noticing we have moved on. The responsibility of people with platforms, with influence, with reach, is to keep saying it, not once, not as a news hook, repeatedly, consistently. Every time there is an opportunity to remind people who are watching that this is still happening, that it has not been resolved, that 900 days of it has produced consequences that will last for generations, that reminder is a moral act. The silence of influential people is also a moral act. It just communicates something different. Next, the moral question, where is God in this? I want to ask a question sincerely, without a predetermined answer. The suffering in Gaza, the hunger, the disease, the deaths of children, the destruction of everything that makes human life feel worth living, does not come from God. Whatever your theology, whatever your tradition, whatever your understanding of the divine, the systematic infliction of death, famine, displacement, and the removal of hope from civilian population is not the work of a loving God. It is the work of human decisions, human choices, human indifference. The tradition that says God is love, that says the defining characteristic of the divine is compassion towards the vulnerable, justice for the oppressed, care for the stranger, has an unambiguous position on what is happening in Gaza. It has always had that position. The prophet said it. Jesus said it. The Psalms said it. The obligation to the stranger, the widow, the orphan, the hungry. It was not peripheral to the faith. It is central. Quote, "For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you welcomed me." Matthew 25:35 ESV. Quote, "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Micah 6:8 ESV. Not support the army of the nation that claims to be God's people. Not celebrate the fulfillment of prophecy as children die. Not remain silent because the politics are complicated. Do justice. Love kindness. Walk humbly. That is the requirement. It is not being met. And the institutions that claim to speak for God, who issued the requirements, have in many cases found other things to say, or said nothing. The question of where God is in this It's actually a question about where we are in God. In the tradition this channel's been examining, acts through human choices. The suffering in Gaza is not God's will. It is the consequence of human choices made by people with power. The alleviation of that suffering will also be a consequence of human choices made by people with power and by ordinary people who choose not to forget, not to look away, and not to accept that this is simply how things are. To conclude, this channel covers power, accountability, and what happens when institutions face facts they would rather ignore. This video has been about a fact that much of the world has found it easier not to face. 900 days, 660,000 children with no school, more than 112,000 dead. Life expectancy in Gaza has fallen from 75 years to 40, a decline of 35 years. Unprecedented in modern recorded history. A generation whose developmental years has been taken, a people whose future has been systematically dismantled. You cannot fix this from a YouTube channel, but we can refuse to forget. We can say it out loud when we have a chance to say it. We can insist that religious institutions that claim to speak for a God of justice and compassion be held to a standard of that claim. We can apply our own humanity to the question of what it means to have lost everything and what it means to have the power to watch that happening and look away. The empathy is still there. It has not left us. It has been suppressed by distance, by news cycles, by the sheer length this time has gone on, and a cultural environment that has made forgetting easier than remembering. The act of choosing to remember is itself a moral act. It is the beginning of accountability that might, one day, produce something different. If this gave you something to think about, please share it. This is the kind of conversation that needs to happen more, not less. Like and subscribe, and do not look away. And thank you.